O'Shaughnessy. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Agribusiness with HighQuest Partners and the Event Director for Women in Agribusiness. I'm talking to you today from my home in Bar Harbor, Maine, and I'm joined by Sara Brew, a partner at Faegre Drinker, who is in her home in Minneapolis. Thanks for being with us today, Sara.
Thank you, Joy. It's my pleasure to be here today, speaking to you and speaking to women in agribusiness.
Well, thanks. We are here to chat for the newly formed Women in Agribusiness Resource Center, where members of the Women in Ag community come together to share practical information to help others in the industry deal with the challenges that we're facing during the COVID-19 crisis. So Sara, can you please help me understand, are we seeing a downturn in the number of inspections at food production facilities due to the virus?
Joy, more than just a downturn in the number of inspections, we've specifically heard from FDA that they're not going to be doing any routine inspections of food production facilities. And that's true of both domestic facilities as well as the foreign facilities that FDA inspects. And the reason is, given the national, and every state has declared an emergency as well, given the national priority of dealing with COVID-19, FDA has decided it's just not worth its resources to be doing routine types of facility inspections. Now, that said, FDA has made clear that if there's a for-cause reason for an inspection, such as they're investigating a recall, or they have reason to believe that adulterated or misbranded product is being produced in a facility, then they would conduct an inspection. And it's also very clear that this is only a temporary policy, but during the duration of the COVID-19 crisis, FDA wants to limit the number of people coming in and out of food production plants. And that includes FDA personnel. It doesn't want to put them at risk by going into plants. At the same time, it recognizes that plants are critical infrastructure. So those food facilities need to be focused on meeting the need for food, not on dealing with routine inspections. So I think we'll see this last for a while, but at some point, once the crisis passes, we'll go back to normal. Then, of course, FDA will be dealing with a backlog of inspections, right, that they have to get through.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense, and it's reassuring to hear that there's some logic and practicality being put in place. But can you then explain where the FDA and the USDA are focusing their efforts?
Yes, FDA and USDA are really focusing their efforts right now on making sure that food is being produced and that food is getting to American consumers. So I think what's become apparent to a lot of people out there in the public, and even some people in the industry, was the fact that we really have two channels of food production, distribution, labeling, and sale in the US. One is through food service. That's your restaurants, your schools, your hotels, your airports, and the other is through consumer purchasing at grocery stores. So right now we have very little food going into the food service side because schools, restaurants, airports are shut down. And at the same time, we have consumers buying an inordinate amount of food from retail grocery stores because that's, everyone's buying at grocery stores and cooking at home. So FDA and USDA are really focused on getting the food that is made for food service into the hands of consumers. And that's more complicated than it sounds. And as a result, there's also a lot of food waste going on the food service side. A good example is potatoes. The vast majority of potatoes produced in the United States go to make French fries in restaurant and food service settings. Now that consumers aren't buying those types of products, those potatoes are sitting. There's no place for them to go. So USDA is trying to get things like potatoes, milk, eggs that go to breakers instead of the shell egg market, other agricultural commodities into the hands of consumers to avoid food waste and to help meet, critical infrastructure food needs. So they're actually doing, as you said before, these are our government agencies at work. Often they're not known for being quick and nimble. But they're actually acting pretty quickly in response to this crisis and just recently, USDA has been doing a lot of buying programs, but just recently they announced a very large purchasing program of excess agricultural commodities so they can help get those to consumers, but also to places like food banks and to programs that are continuing to provide meals to the community that children may have gotten when they were in school and they're no longer in school. So that's really their important mission right now.
Thank you, Sarah. And speaking of consumers, is there anything specific that consumers should be aware of when purchasing food that might have, in terms of labeling, that might have been destined for food service as opposed to retail?
Yes, when consumers are out buying food in retail that may originally have been labeled for food service, there's a couple important things to keep in mind. The first one is to know that the food is safe. The relabeling that allows food to go from food service into retail grocery store setting, it's not compromising food safety. Instead, what it's doing is making sure that consumers still have some critical information. You're going to have the net weight of what it is that you're buying. You're going to have what we call in the food regulatory world the statement of identity that just tells you what it is that you're buying, like frozen potatoes. And then you're going to have the ingredient statement, so consumers will still be able to see the ingredients. And of course, if there are allergens, which is an important labeling food safety issue, the allergens will be labeled. You're also going to have the name of the manufacturer, so if there's a problem, you know who to contact. But what is not going to be there is the nutrition facts panel. So that's that little grid that we're all used to seeing on our consumer packaged goods that tells us calories, and it tells us serving size, and it tells us certain nutritional information like the amount of certain vitamins, sugars, carbohydrates, and fats. That is missing. But the idea is it's more important to get this food out to consumers with critical food safety information like allergens, even if it's lacking some of the nutritional information.
Okay. Well, that's good to know and very reassuring. Obviously, anything coming out of our food system, you would hope that people would understand is safe, but when there are changes to the system, it's great for people to understand what they are. So thank you. Has the CDC instituted any new guidelines or strategies for businesses to implement to help reduce the potential spread of coronavirus, since we're talking about understanding the safety of the system?
Yes, CDC has been very active. Again, it's one of the agencies that's working hand in hand with USDA and with FDA, and also with state and local public health authorities. When it comes to food processing specifically, oh, and I should mention OSHA too. OSHA, all of these agencies have been acting in concert. When it comes to specific recommendations and policies for food production facilities, FDA has deferred to CDC and to OSHA, and CDC has not come out with specific requirements to food facilities, except recently in the case of meat and poultry workers. And there they have implemented some specific requirements that I think are useful for all types of food manufacturers and distributors to know. One is they've made clear that food production facilities and distributors need to have a COVID-19 assessment and control plan. So right now that's required for meat and poultry operators. I think it's something we may see required for other types of food processing and distribution facilities. So that plan is going to identify the risk and identify specific risks that may exist depending on your type of facility, and then specific controls for those risks. Now, some of those that CDC has identified as sort of risks and controls in the meat and poultry setting are the spacing of employees, how close they are to one another. Meat production is notoriously known for having people literally standing side by side. So that's a factor to consider. The other factor to consider is the length of time that employees are having exposure to one another. So often in meat production, employees will work 12-hour shifts. And during almost the entirety of that 12-hour shift, they will be side by side. In other production scenarios, employees may not work that long. They may be spaced out in geography, so the risk is different. CDC also wants to identify other types of contacts that employees might have in the employment setting. So that would be, what does it look like in your locker rooms? What are your break rooms and cafeterias look like? How many employees are in there at a time? How close are they? What is it like when employees enter and exit? Are they all funneled out of a narrow area so there's lots of contact? Are there shared tools that people will be having contact with that are transferred back and forth to people? All of these things are very specific to individual facilities and how product is produced. So manufacturers, distributors should be thinking about and looking at these things right now and making plans. The other one, which is really interesting and is sort of unique to meat and poultry processing, but probably applies to other facilities as well, is CDC has said to look at other ways that employees may be having contact outside of the employment setting. So for instance, do you have an employment population that often ride shares to work? Do you have an employment population that also often shares housing or do a lot of community activities together outside of work? That's been a big issue for some of the meat and poultry processing plants, and it's something that employers should be aware of when they're formulating these assessment and control plans.
That's really interesting. To be honest, in all of the discussions I've had around that, I've not come across that topic of discussion yet, and it makes sense. I socialize with my colleagues as well, so.
But I think it also shows that these plans and the assessment of risk and the way you deal with risk of employee transmission of COVID-19 is so specific to the industry, to the plant, to the product. So that's one of the reasons we often don't see issuance of sort of one-size-fits-all rules. It's really about you need to have a plan where you think about your specific situation. And also, now is probably a really good time to insert, just to make it clear, that FDA and USDA have made it absolutely clear that there's no food safety risk with COVID-19. That is, there's no real risk of transmission of COVID-19 through food products or through food packaging. Early on, that was a big concern among consumers. There were questions of, if I have sick employees, do I need to do a recall? The answer to that is clear, and the answer is no.
Well, that's good to know. And thank you for making that point for everyone. So I had one last question for you because we're talking about challenges or problems in the past few minutes, but I'd really like to hear from you if you see any post-pandemic upsides for our industry specifically.
Yes, I think, as with all types of crises that we endure together, there will be some benefits that come out of all of this disruption and challenge right now. I think on a sort of more micro level, what we will see is that these COVID-19, assessment and control plans will become the industry norm, and at some point, they will become required. As a matter of fact, I think facilities may be required to have broader infectious disease control plans. This is an issue. In the past, we've never seen large outbreaks of communicable diseases between employees and facilities. There have been a few tuberculosis type incidents in the past, but nothing that has really created this type of focus. The focus has always been on food safety, right? And food transmitted illnesses, not on communicable disease illnesses between employees. So I think everyone should anticipate that just like you have a recall plan, just like you may have a consumer complaints plan, just like you have standard sanitary operating procedures, you're going to need some kind of infectious disease, prevention and control plan. At the same time, I think more broadly, more from a macro level, that we are going to see the industry be more aware of this divide between food service and food retail, and more focus on things like having flexible and nimble supply chains, having more flexibility on production, mechanisms of distribution, so that if we encounter future issues like this, it'll be easier to effectively move food from the food service side to consumers when there's a need. And I think, as we go forward, there will be more lessons learned, all of which will make the food supply even safer, both for consumers and for workers in the future.
Thank you for that, Sara. Personally, I'm glad to hear what you were saying, and I agree. For years, there's been plenty of reasons for us to make sure we're focusing on an efficient supply chain. I have a feeling the horizon holds for us for companies to be looking for more resilient ones as well. So I think there are a lot of pluses to be had in the situation, and I'm excited to see what they are. I hope there's some in sustainability and lots of other areas. So, but I'm so grateful for your time today, that joining us and sharing your expertise with our audience, our Women in Ag community. And I hope that you and your family are safe and whole. And I'm just grateful for your being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. It's been a pleasure speaking to you and Women in Agribusiness from here in my kitchen, appropriately enough, in Minneapolis.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody.